My name is Dr. Josephine Palermo, and my superpower is creating business cultures that transform organizations team by team. Recently, I had a great conversation with Maria Morukian, President of MSM Global Consulting, author and Diversity and Inclusion Practitioner. Maria's company was recognised as one of the top 10 diversity and inclusion companies by Manage HR magazine in 2022. She shares practical tips for enacting change in organisations in the conversation today, especially in turbulent times where diversity, inclusion and equity are facing extraordinary challenges in the US and at home in Australia. My pleasure to have Maria Morukian on the podcast today, and you're coming. We're doing a live, so this will be on YouTube as well. And Maria, you're president of MSM Global Consulting, whose mission is to help organisations develop and implement strategies to create a more equitable and inclusive global workforce and fuel lasting change, which is one of my passions as well. And you've got a really long track record, having served as a consultant, a coach, a facilitator, provided a lot of guidance around to leaders and organisations on diversity, equity, inclusion, leadership development and organisational transformation. You've been featured in Forbes and TD magazine, and your company was recognised as a top 10 diversity and inclusion company by Manager HR magazine in 2022. So congratulations on that. That's wonderful. Not that it doesn't stop there. You are also a podcast host, and your podcast Culture Stew has gone into its 4th season, so a really popular podcast. And you're an adjunct faculty at American University, and of course, because in your spare time you wrote a book, and so you're an author of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion for Trainers Fostering DEI in the Workplace, and that came out in 2022. So we'll put some links in show notes and in the below this video as well. But that sounds like a lot, and that's why I love talking to people like you. It's such a privilege to meet really global thought leaders particularly in the area of diversity and inclusion, really helping organizations and leaders transform. But how did you get here? Where did you start, Maria?
So I think that I'll give sort of a brief backstory in terms of my upbringing, because I think that it really started with my childhood and the experiences that I had, as well as the stories that I heard from my family members. So I'm U.S. citizen, born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, and I often tell people I grew up in a very prototypical white middle class uh, upbringing, and in my community we all looked a lot alike, we spoke a lot alike, we worshiped the same way. There were a lot of similarities, a lot of homogeneity, even though Detroit is one of the most racially, ethnically diverse communities
Right,
in the
yes.
United States, and it's deeply segregated.
Mm.
So some of the experiences that I had that I think kind of forged my journey. One is that although on the outside I looked just like most people in my community, I did come from a multicultural family, multilingual, bicultural family. My father and his family members were refugees twice over, fleeing Istanbul, Turkey during the Armenian genocide, landing in Cuba. So my dad actually was born and grew up in Havana.
Oh, wow.
And came to the US when he was a young man. So very interesting sort of multicultural, multilingual experience that he brought with him. And then he married my mother, who grew up in a tiny little farming community in northern Michigan where 4 generations, everybody's, and so her first language was English, even though she was a 4th generation. So sort of melding of cultural identities, I think, was very prevalent in my childhood and my upbringing. And my parents were both teachers, public school teachers, and they worked in inner city schools in Detroit. So I think I had this essence of the importance of understanding cultural identity And I also had this
Mm.
exposure to significant racism that was occurring in the, anti-blackness in the United States, as well as socioeconomic divides. So as a kid, I didn't really get any of that, right? But somehow intrinsically my experience and perspectives, and that really shaped my personal and my professional choices, and definitely my career. I've always felt drawn to focusing on the human side of organizations, and the thinking about sort of the psychology and the sociology of organizations and
Mm.
systems, and I've always been deeply drawn to culture and stories, and sort of just the narratives and the way that people experience the world in such different ways and interpret one another and misinterpret one another
Yeah.
quite often. And so I've always felt like it is my purpose, my call to action, to build those bridges, to
Mm.
create connections across
Mm.
those different.
It's always fascinating to me because I'm a systems thinker as well, and as you speak, and particularly as you describe sort of how you got here, there, I have a migrant background in my history as
Mm,
well, my recent family history, and I think there's a sense that when you've experienced some kind of marginalization, there's a sense of the system that comes into play for you, not for everyone, but I think, and I'm always interested in how people get to that, because it's not just through experiencing marginalization. Some people get to that by just understanding their privilege as well, but it's really it's stepping away and almost looking at the matrix and saying we're in a system that actually does not provide equal access to resources in society, to opportunities in society, to everyone, and it's not about what people do individually. It's actually what their role is, as determined by the system structures and processes that we're all sometimes oblivious to. So thank you for that, Maria. I love that. It's and very eclectic background. So interesting, really interesting life that and you've come to such a life of purpose, and does that really drive you? Because obviously you've got a family, you've got young children. Does
mm.
that drive you? Because you've achieved a lot. You're still achieving a lot.
Yes, I think it absolutely does.
Yeah.
And I think what has been very present for me, especially in the last, I would say, 12 years or so, really since my first daughter was born, is that um, for me, the notion of professional and personal life is very melded together. Not only
Mm,
because I am passionate about my work and I want to spend time uh, engaging in it,
mm,
and continuously learning and challenging myself on a professional level, but also because I think that this work is so absolutely paramount for us to be able to make the make the world better for the next generation.
yeah.
And I am endlessly surprised and deeply appreciative of what I learn from my children at every stage of their childhood. But um, the ability that they have to take some of these concepts that we as adults seem to be struggling with so much, and and play with those ideas, and bring compassion, and their levels of emotional intelligence are off the charts. So it is inspiring to me,
Mm,
and I think also just constantly reinforces to me that I'm doing this work not only for a paycheck, not only to be able to put these things on my resume. I'm doing it because it can help uh, it can help open people's eyes up, and
yeah.
hopefully make our systems more equitable for my kids and for other people's kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in the US, and there's quite a, in some ways, disturbing set of debates going on at times around diversity and equity, inclusion training and other efforts. And there's been some real, some real, in some ways, backlash, arguments, and we've seen a lot of retreats back into, from progress made over the last, the decades in, for example, the abortion debate and the access to abortion in terms of women's rights, but also there's been some real retreats in terms of, I think, education around race and what schools are doing. Could you give us, Maria, because you're much more immersed in that, could you give us a bit of a broad sweep of what are the major things that you're a bit concerned about at the moment in the US?
Mm,
And I think we can learn, I think from in Australia, we can learn from what's happening there because we're going through a process
mm,
of voting for a referendum to acknowledge our First Nations people in our constitution that we have never acknowledged. And our First Nations people have been here for 60,000 years,
mm,
and we're also voting on a voice which is a representation to our parliament of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I think that we're experiencing some of these debates, and particularly in this country. So yeah, could you give us a broad sweep? Because I'm always a
mm.
bit disturbed by what I hear, but then I meet people like you are really fighting the good fight as well. So yeah, so if you could give us your view, I think that would be fantastic.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So, gosh, I wish we had several hours to dive deep into this, but short version, I think that there are a couple of things that are um, really present in terms of the challenges that we're experiencing as a country, and in particular what we DEI practitioners are seeing. And first and foremost, the backlash against equity, against even having conversations about the multiple truths of our shared history as a country. I think that that backlash, to be quite honest, was expected. Uh, we have seen this before. Anytime that there is some sort of a catalyst for social progress and change, especially when it comes to civil rights, there is inevitably uh, a backlash to that. And we've seen it, it's cyclical. So I think for many of us as practitioners, we were just waiting for this to happen. And I think we're still in the throes of it. Um, the and I don't think that, yes, absolutely, there have been significant, there's been backpedaling, right? There has been regression in a number of places in terms of, Roe versus Wade being overturned, in terms of some of the state legislation that has been increasingly happening in mostly conservative states around what is taught in public schools, uh, and it's frightening in a lot of ways because the level of censorship that is happening and the fear that that is instilling in educators, librarians, academics, um, uh, government leaders at every level, from municipal to federal. So I think that there are some really significant challenges that are coming about because of some of the legislative changes. And there are also, as there always have been, really people who are much smarter than I am, who can figure out the loopholes, the workarounds, the ways to continue to do the work that needs to be done despite some of these setbacks. What I am most concerned about, and what a lot of political scientists in the United States are concerned about, is the level of polarization and the vitriol that is coming with that societal and ideological polarization that we really have not seen in our country ever, in at least in modern history, for to this extent. And it's been happening increasingly for decades, but it's really hit a fever pitch. And this political scientists actually have a name for this. They call it pernicious polarization. And pernicious polarization occurs when people who begin to connect their ideological beliefs with their identities. So the two become intrinsically connected. And when we do that, it becomes harder and harder for us to be able to find common ground, to be able to even have conversations where we listen to maybe different from our own. And we increasingly seek out people who reinforce our existing beliefs. And that erodes our democracy over time. Because what we're seeing is that not only do we say, I'm right and you're wrong, but increasingly it's leading to, at the societal level, at the community level, people from one side of the ideological spectrum looking at anyone who opposes their views as immoral and ignorant and dangerous and untrustworthy. And so that's what the political scientists have been, sort of raising the alarm around, because there is no democracy in the world to at this point that has existed with such an extent of polarization as what we're experiencing in the United States, and been able to walk back from that. So we're in really dire straits as a society, and I think that what I'm hearing now is, yes, there's the backlash, and yes, there's there continue to be there continue to be a lot of mistruths, really, for lack of a better phrase, and falsehoods that are being put out there. But what I'm also hearing is many people across the United States, from every part of the political spectrum, saying we need to come together. We
Yeah.
are exhausted and we're tired of being
It's not sustainable.
at war with each other, and we want to be in community. We
Yeah.
want a more holistic society, but we don't even know how to get there anymore. So I think we're at a critical stage where there's still an opportunity for us to rebuild that sense of who we are, but it's going to take a lot of work.
All right. So we're at a real juncture, yeah, in
Yeah.
terms of intervening at that stage or facing the consequences, which in some ways you're hearing nobody wants. So that realization perhaps is giving you a little bit of hope there. It sounds like, yeah. And
Yes.
Maria, what's the role of the D&I practitioner? What are you doing, or perhaps what are you seeing your colleagues doing, and particularly in organizations? Because we can impact society at large through organizations, individual by individual or team by team. So what do you think the role is there?
I think that D&I practitioners play an absolutely critical role in terms of being able to bring those opposing views together, and to create spaces where it is not only acceptable but encouraged to explore these uncomfortable topics, and to see that as an important part of building community within our organizations. And so I think a lot of times, there's been this sort of notion that we leave our feelings outside, we leave our political beliefs outside,
Yes.
just come in and do your work, and then that lives in your personal life. But we can say that all we want, but people are bringing that.
Yeah.
Whether it is safe for them to share it or not is another thing. And so I think D&I practitioners can play an absolutely important role in terms of creating that space for people to realize that, when we sit down and have a conversation with each other, and we talk about what we really think and feel and believe, we actually find that we have more in common than we originally thought. And we start to humanize one another again. We start to listen because we feel listened to. And even if we walk away still vehemently disagreeing, we are connected, and we have respect, and we honor one another. It also becomes easier when we create those spaces for people to honestly respond and provide feedback when somebody does engage in any sort of behavior that causes harm.
Yeah.
and it's easier for the people who cause that harm to receive that feedback without becoming defensive. I think what is so challenging right now when it comes to even, I mean, even saying the words, it's become such a trigger word, right? It's become this concept that is either, oh, that's meant to divide us. We don't talk about that, right? Or it's actually exclusionary if we talk about equity and inclusion.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what these terms really mean and who they serve. And so I think D&I practitioners have a critical role in being able to deconstruct these concepts so that people see themselves reflected in it.
Yeah, so it's a really that it's opening dialogue and opening spaces for dialogue. And I think you're right. I think sometimes we don't go into dialogue because we don't know the answers, or we don't, or we avoid the conflict. And so what you're saying is go into open dialogue anyway. How do you do that in organizations? Can you maybe describe some things that have worked before or some tactics that you recommend?
Sure. So, one of the most profound experiences that I've had was I partnered with some colleagues who actually use psychodrama and theater as a means
Mm,
for
yeah.
engaging folks in dialogue. And so and we did this all virtually because it was in the middle
Oh,
of the
wow.
pandemic. And so we did what's called playback theater, where we brought a group of people together from an organization and we asked them to take a few moments and think about and then share an experience, right? We
Hmm.
asked them, some specific kind of questions to probe the story, and then we actually had some volunteers who shared their story with the group, and the actors then played back the stories. And it sounds so simple. It was deeply moving, and it
Mm,
was an incredible experience for, in this particular context, the the reactions from the audience when we polled people and asked them afterwards, what was that like for you? What
yeah.
feelings did you experience listening to this person's story be shared?
Mm,
And in this particular situation, we were centering a lot of it on racism
yeah.
in this particular industry that we're doing with. And what was fascinating, it's sort of an additional aha moment for a lot of the participants, was that most of the white participants reacted with this shock. And
Yeah.
I feel guilty. I feel guilty that I didn't know this. I
Mm-mm.
also feel appreciative that we're having this conversation. And for the people of color in the room, to them it was more, yeah, of course, right? I mean, I
This
feel
is
seen because
known.
I know that others
Yeah.
have experienced the same harm that I have, but I'm not coming out of this experience yet with a sense of um, that I've learned anything new,
Mm-mm.
or necessarily that I trust that things will change.
Yeah.
That was a powerful moment, I think, for the white folks in the room who came out of this saying, "This was so great," and then to
Yes.
hear their colleagues say, what's coming after this, that's what
Yeah.
I care about.
Yeah.
So it led to some really important actionable work
Yeah. I
that came
love
after
that.
that. And there's some really interesting research that backs this up, that there's a lot that's been talked about how DEI training is not necessarily very effective, and
Mm-mm.
is a huge financial burden for a lot of organizations without a lot of return on investment that they can see. And some of the research that's come out indicates that the type of training that does work centers itself on perspective taking through
Mm-mm.
storytelling, through giving people opportunities to share and learn and humanize, and having some sort of a call to action.
Yeah.
The so what, now what? Okay, we have this heightened awareness, we have this connection with each other, we recognize that these biases are having an
Yes.
impact on us and others. What do we do now?
That's
And so
right.
if we don't focus on the what we do now and give people something that they can actually
Mm.
take and practice in their day-to-day lives, then
Yeah.
this work sort of dies on the vine.
Yeah, I feel like D&I training has had a bad rap because it's almost like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because
Yeah.
to your point, the reason why it's probably not had an effect is because you've had that lack of action from the organization who need to commit at a real senior level. If your top team isn't committed to action or to really making some progress on D&I, then you can't expect a training program to affect that change without enacting that social change from leadership all the way down. So you're absolutely right there.
Mhm.
Mm. What in particular could organizations do today, if you've got people listening today that are thinking, what could I
Mhm.
do, what's the first thing I could do, what would be the top three things, or the recommended things that organizations could do today to really help open up that dialogue? And it might be, to your point, have an expert in who can help you with that, but within sort of limited resources, I guess I'm thinking about, what can people do?
Sure. So a couple of things. Ideally, starting with some sort of data gathering process, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a big,
Mm,
substantial, assessment. Although that's, if possible, that's the best way to
yeah.
get all of the data. But even if it's just um, some sort of informal town hall
Mm,
where you're polling people and asking them to share their experiences anonymously,
yeah.
or adding in some questions if they don't already exist in any sort of employee engagement surveys, or workplace culture assessments that are already in the
Mm-mm.
in the rotation in the organization. So I think the more that you can integrate it into what already
Yeah.
exists, that's really helpful. And because we need to get that data, what often happens is that senior leaders will contact me and they'll say, okay, we're not exactly sure what we need to do, but we want to do something. And I'll begin by asking them, what are the pain points? And more often than not, they they will say, oh, well, things are pretty good here. Maybe we have a couple of issues. Maybe we don't have as much representation at the senior levels as we
Yeah.
want, but for the most part, and I'll
I
say, well,
hear
let me
that a
talk
lot
with,
too.
right, let me talk with some of the employees. And it's, and they are often shocked and frustrated and sometimes defensive when they do get the data back that shows them that not everyone is having this happy, peachy experience.
Yeah.
In fact, some people are really struggling and have been for quite some time.
Mm-mm.
So any way to capture those stories, I think, is really important to
Mm.
as a starting point. Um, Secondly, it has to start with leadership. People in those highly visible power positions have to do their own work and recognize that they play such a significant role in determining and sustaining the organizational culture that either helps or hinders people's ability to really thrive within that organization.
Mm.
And so that takes time, I think, because all of us believe ourselves, and we're well-intentioned,
Yes. Yeah.
thoughtful, kind humans, and we all see ourselves that way and see our actions through that lens. But not everyone is
Mm.
experiencing us or the organizational culture in that way. And so I think take some humility to acknowledge it,
Yeah.
but it's really important.
Yeah.
So those are a couple I could go on, but the two that I would suggest.
I just had a lag, so I'm just going to stop for a second. Okay, keep going. Thank you, Maria.
Okay.
I think that they're really great suggestions and really good recommendations. I think you touched on this earlier. I think partly the problem is that people in privilege need to recognize that the systems that advantaged them, in other words, the systems that got them to that position of privilege, are also the systems that we need to disrupt and change. And I think that's a really difficult realization, a difficult insight to make. And even if you make that insight, what do you do about it? Because it affects you as the person, who's benefiting from your position in that system. And then secondly, it's how do you cope with that? Perhaps, you touched on it before, feelings of guilt, and maybe even shame because and I do you have any insights there based on sort of what particularly I think because in the US you've been grappling with that around particularly
Mm.
around race and equity there and perhaps there's some things we can learn from you around that.
For others, it is defensiveness and anger, right? What are you telling me? I have privilege? I, I don't, I've struggled, in so many ways to get where I have today. So who are
Mm,
you to tell me my story? And I
yes.
think that's valid. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we tend to paint people with the same narrow brush
Mm-mm.
that we're accusing them of painting
Yeah.
us with. And it's deeply human.
Yeah.
It's part of our conditioning, our social identity grouping. So I think we have to find ways to override that. And something as simple as telling people you're all biased is not going to do it,
Mm,
right? But giving people opportunities, these little mental and psychological nudges to reshape the way that they are looking
yeah.
at these issues is really important. And so there's easy ways for us to do that, even just in terms of putting in some questions into our decision making processes with our team.
Yes.
Whose voice is not
Yes.
represented here? And how do we get those voices? And
Mm-mm.
what would be the value to us
Mm.
if we include those voices?
Yeah.
So rather than it being a finger wagging,
Yeah.
it's what is possible. I just read a book called Inclusion Nudges. And what I like about it is it's a very practical, deceptively simple guide with just tools that we can introduce into our day to day
Mm,
to really embed DEI into the DNA of the organization. That's a
mm.
lot of acronyms, right? But something as simple as when we're looking at candidate selection,
Yeah.
either somebody coming in from for a new position or promoting others, rather than starting with who's the one ideal qualified candidate and why, saying all of these candidates are qualified. So why not
Mm,
them?
mm, mm.
And there's something about shifting that thinking to explore the potential value of each of these individuals, including those that don't fit the proverbial norm,
Yes. Yeah, I love that.
that gives us a new way of thinking,
Yeah.
rather than looking for culture fit, looking for what is the culture that we want and who
Mm-mm.
can contribute to that.
Yeah.
So small things that I think we can be doing that can
Mm,
have a significant impact on the long-term
mm,
sustainability of this work.
mm.
And it makes it feel more digestible because I think
Yes.
folks are just, especially for those who are coming from a place of, I feel great shame and guilt. What do I do with this? I don't
Yes.
want to feel this anymore.
Yeah.
And so then they either get stuck there and fall into the place of feeling defensive and I give up no matter what I do. I'm going to be, punished for it.
Mm-mm-mm.
And so they draw back, or uh, or people just get, kind of get stuck in that they become fatigued, right? I'm burnt out. I don't know what
Yes.
else to do.
Yeah, and it seems
So
like a too to the problems is too big to deal with, and
yeah,
this is the problems with when we because what we're dealing with are systems level problems, but we need to
yes,
tackle those problems at the individual and social relationship level. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm,
absolutely.
mm,
And that doesn't mean that it's easy.
mm.
And that doesn't mean that just do this one thing and it will fix everything. But it's what are nation on small things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Maria, thank you for that. I wanted to just check though. So you wrote a book in 2022. Tell me a little bit about the book. Have we covered some of the themes in the book, or was there other things that, were really sort of the insights that you gained from writing the book? Were there other things that you'd want to share?
Thank you. Yes. So the book, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Trainers, Fostering DEI in the Workplace, it was published by ATD, the Association for Talent Development. And so the initial focus and the audience was professional trainers
Mm,
and talent development
great.
practitioners. Um, and I really wrote the book thinking about what do I wish somebody had told me when I
Yeah.
first started doing this work. And I wanted it to be a practical guide for anybody, regardless of where they are in their developmental stage of this work. What has been profoundly exciting, I guess, for lack of a better word, for me is the output of people coming forth who are not trainers, who are not in talent development, who are either the accidental trainers who volunteered themselves because they care about this, or the people who are, they're trying to make change happen in their organization from a leadership level, a management level, a contributor level, and they have found value in reading the book and using what it's providing. So that's been really great to see that it serves a broader audience and a broader group than I had originally anticipated. I think one thing that we haven't really talked about too deeply in our conversation today, but I do cover in the book, is there are similarities and there are differences when it comes to doing DEI in a global setting. And so I do devote a chapter of the book to, okay, we often hear about DEI with this very US centric lens, but how do we also integrate intercultural communications and concepts into this work, and recognize, yes, absolutely, this work is needed universally. Although universally, I think this work is necessary, it needs to look different. We need to integrate intercultural concepts and communication and really think about and design for these different cultural contexts in which we may find ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in the work that I do, I'm often doing that work as well, because there's in Australia in particular, there's we often deal with levels of difference that are around the multicultural population that we have, because we have quite a vast history of migration here. So yeah, so that's interesting that you have that chapter in the book. Well, thank you, Maria. Let's I'm sure we will have another conversation. It's been so great to meet you. I'll put all the links in the show notes, and we'll refer to your publication as well, so if anyone wants to grab that, they can. But where can people find you? What's the best place to find you?
Absolutely. So my website is www.msmglobalconsulting.com. I would also invite people to, you can sign up for our newsletter. We have a monthly newsletter through the website. LinkedIn is probably one of the places where I spend the most time in terms of social media, connecting with other DEI practitioners and sharing some of our experiences and practices. And then, of course, our podcast, Culture Stew, which very similarly, I think, to this podcast, focuses on these issues from a storytelling lens, exploring sort of the multi-dimensional aspects of identity. So people can find Culture Stew anywhere where they get their podcasts as well.
Yeah, fabulous. All right. Thank you so much, Maria. It was lovely to have you here. Thank you for the very compelling conversation, and hopefully we can do it again.
Thank you, Josephine.
All right. Bye.